What would you do if you discovered that beneath the peaceful facade of a small Alabama town lies a century-old secret so disturbing that those who uncover it never speak of it again? Have you ever wondered what terrible truths might be hidden just beneath your feet, sealed away by those desperate to forget? In the scorching summer of 1908, while America celebrated its emergence as a world power and Theodore Roosevelt prepared to hand the presidency to William Howard Taft, a discovery was made in the small town of Whitehaven, Alabama, that would challenge the very foundations of what the local community believed about one of its most prominent families. What began as a routine renovation project on the old Blackwood Plantation estate would unearth a horror that many in power would spend decades trying to bury once again. The Blackwood estate, once the crown jewel of Talladega County's plantation aristocracy, had stood abandoned for nearly 6 years when Joseph Miller, a northern industrialist with textile ambitions in the South, purchased the property at an auction held by the county. The massive Greek Revival mansion, with its towering white columns and sprawling grounds, had fallen into disrepair since the mysterious disappearance of the last Blackwood heirs, identical twin sisters Eliza and Eleanor, in 1902. County records show that Miller paid a sum of $8,400 for the estate, a fraction of its pre-war value, but still a considerable investment in an area struggling to rebuild its economy. The sale was finalized on June 12, 1908, with papers signed by Judge William Hartwell, a longtime associate of the Blackwood family and executor of the estate in the absence of living heirs. I purchased the property with the intention of restoring it to its former glory, Miller would later state in his deposition to the Talladega County Sheriff's Department. The house required extensive renovations, but the foundation was sound. I hired a crew of 12 men, mostly local workers in need of employment, to begin clearing the grounds and assessing the structural needs of the main house. The foreman of this crew was Samuel Johnson, a 47-year-old freedman who had worked on numerous construction projects throughout the county since the end of the Civil War. Johnson's reputation for thoroughness and attention to detail had made him one of the most sought-after foremen in the region, despite the racial tensions that still permeated Southern society. According to Johnson's journal, which was discovered among his possessions after his death in 1934, the crew began work on the Blackwood estate on June 17, 1908. The first week was spent clearing overgrown vegetation from the grounds and making a thorough assessment of the property. "The mansion itself is grand but neglected," Johnson wrote on June 19th. "Water damage has compromised portions of the east wing roof, and there is evidence of termite activity in the servant quarters. The grounds contain numerous outbuildings in various states of disrepair, including a carriage house, smokehouse, old slave quarters, and a well house that appears to have been sealed with recent masonry work." This last observation, seemingly insignificant at the time, would prove to be the thread that, when pulled, would unravel a tapestry of horror that had been carefully woven into the very fabric of Whitehaven society. The well house, a small brick structure located approximately 70 yards behind the main house, drew Johnson's attention due to the contrast between the weathered exterior and the relatively new-looking mortar sealing the entrance. Unlike other structures on the property, the well house showed signs of recent human activity. "The mortar around the well house door cannot be more than 6 or 7 years old," Johnson noted in his journal. "While the structure itself dates back to before the war, someone has taken great care to seal this building completely, not just the door. But even the small window has been bricked over." On June 25th, acting on Miller's instructions to inspect all structures before beginning renovations, Johnson and 3 workers, Thomas Green, Henry Wilson, and Marcus Lee, began removing the newer brickwork from the well house entrance. What they found inside would cast a shadow over Whitehaven that some believe lingers to this day. The official report filed with the Talladega County Sheriff's Office on June 26, 1908, provides the first documented account of the discovery. Upon gaining entry to the well house on the former Blackwood Plantation, workers discovered that the well itself, a shaft approximately 3 feet in diameter and of unknown depth, had been sealed with a concrete cap. This cap, estimated to be 6 years old, had been poured over a wooden platform. When workers removed a portion of this cap to inspect the well's condition, they detected a powerful odor emanating from below. Further investigation revealed the presence of human remains at the bottom of the well shaft. This clinical description belies the horror of what was actually discovered. As revealed in Samuel Johnson's more detailed personal account, we broke through the edge of the concrete seal by midday, creating a hole about the size of a dinner plate. The stench that rose from that opening was unlike anything I have ever experienced. A miasma of decay so powerful that Marcus immediately vomited and had to step outside. Thomas lowered a lantern on a length of rope, and what we saw defies easy description. At the bottom of the well, perhaps 20 feet down, were the remains of what appeared to be 2 people, their bodies partially mummified in the dry, airless environment. They were entwined together, as if embracing in their final moments. Both wore the tattered remains of what had once been fine dresses. The Talladega County Sheriff, James Parker, arrived at the Blackwood estate with 4 deputies later that afternoon. After confirming the workers' grim discovery, Parker ordered the well sealed temporarily while he telegraphed the state authorities for assistance. His initial report, preserved in county archives, indicates his immediate suspicion. The remains appear to be female, likely deceased for several years. Given the circumstances and location, there is reasonable suspicion that these may be the remains of the missing Blackwood sisters, Eliza and Eleanor, who vanished without trace in 1902. I have requested assistance from Montgomery in recovering and identifying the remains. The disappearance of the Blackwood twins had been one of the most perplexing mysteries in Talladega County's recent history. 24 years old at the time of their disappearance, the sisters were the sole surviving members of the once influential Blackwood family. Their parents, Colonel William Blackwood and his wife Margaret, had both died of typhoid fever in 1897, leaving their vast estate to their only children. The sisters, known for their identical appearance and inseparable nature, had managed the plantation with unexpected success in the years following their parents' deaths. Eleanor, the elder by 17 minutes, had a head for business that surprised many of the local landowners, while Eliza was known for her artistic temperament and social grace. Together, they had maintained the Blackwood legacy despite the challenges facing southern plantation owners in the new century. And then, in the early autumn of 1902, they vanished. According to the original missing persons report filed on September 12th of that year, the sisters had last been seen riding in their carriage toward town on the morning of September 9th. When they failed to return that evening, their estate manager, George Wilson, had organized a search party. The carriage was found abandoned on the road back to the plantation, with no sign of the twins or the driver, a freedman named Isaac Taylor. The original investigation, led by Sheriff Parker himself, had found no evidence of foul play beyond the abandoned carriage. The prevailing theory had been that the sisters had taken the opportunity to flee their responsibilities, perhaps to Europe or the North, taking the loyal Taylor with them to start a new life away from the decaying remnants of Southern aristocracy. Now, the discovery in the well suggested a far darker fate. State authorities arrived from Montgomery on June 28th, led by Dr. Edgar Harrison, a medical examiner with experience in forensic investigation. The recovery of the remains was a gruesome and difficult process. Documented in Harrison's official report, the well shaft, measuring approximately 20 feet in depth, contained the remains of 2 adult human females and 1 adult human male. The female remains were found embracing at the very bottom of the shaft, while the male remains were discovered approximately 5 feet above them. All three bodies show evidence of violent trauma consistent with either a fall or being thrown down the shaft. However, the positioning of the female remains suggests they were alive when they reached the bottom, as their final position appears to be one they assumed voluntarily, rather than as a result of how they fell. Harrison's detailed examination of the remains, conducted in a temporary morgue set up in one of the Plantation outbuildings, confirmed what many had already suspected, based on dental records provided by Dr. Samuel Edwards, the longtime physician to the Blackwood family. I can confirm with reasonable medical certainty that the female remains are those of Eliza and Eleanor Blackwood. The male remains, based on physical characteristics and items found on the body, appear to be those of Isaac Taylor, the carriage driver reported missing alongside the sisters. The cause of death, as determined by Harrison, painted a horrific picture of the victim's final moments. The male victim, identified as Isaac Taylor, appears to have died from blunt force trauma consistent with a fall or being thrown down the well shaft. Multiple fractures to the skull, spine, and limbs suggest he was either unconscious or dead when he impacted the bottom of the well. The female victims, identified as Eliza and Eleanor Blackwood, present a more complex picture. While both show evidence of injury consistent with a fall, these injuries do not appear to have been immediately fatal. The positioning of their bodies, embraced tightly together, suggests they survived the initial fall. The cause of death appears to be a combination of their injuries and subsequent dehydration or starvation. Most disturbing is the evidence that they survived for some period of time at the bottom of the well. The fingernails of both women show damage consistent with attempts to climb the smooth stone walls of the shaft, and there are marks in the stone that corroborate this theory. Perhaps most chilling was Harrison's final observation. The well appears to have been deliberately sealed while the Blackwood sisters were still alive. As news of the discovery spread through Whitehaven, the initial shock and horror quickly gave way to a more complicated response from the townspeople. While many expressed outrage and demanded justice for the murdered women, others, particularly those with close ties to the old plantation families, called for discretion and restraint in the investigation. Judge William Hartwell, who had served as executor of the Blackwood estate following the sisters' disappearance, was among the most vocal advocates for handling the matter with appropriate delicacy. In a letter to Sheriff Parker dated July 1st, 1908, Hartwell wrote, "While this discovery is indeed tragic, we must consider the impact that a public spectacle would have on our community. The Blackwood name has long been synonymous with the dignity and honor of Whitehaven society. A protracted investigation, particularly one that might cast aspersions on respected members of our community, would serve no purpose but to further traumatize a town that has already lost so much in recent years." Sheriff Parker, however, was determined to pursue justice. His response to Hartwell, preserved in his personal correspondence, was unequivocal. "With all due respect, Judge Hartwell, 2 women and a man were murdered and sealed in a well on the Blackwood estate. As an officer of the law, I cannot and will not handle this with delicacy, if that means allowing their killers to escape justice. I intend to pursue this investigation wherever it leads, regardless of the names or positions of those who may be implicated." And so began one of the most controversial murder investigations in Alabama's history, one that would expose the dark underbelly of Southern gentility and reveal how far some would go to protect the social order of the post-Reconstruction South. The investigation began with a thorough examination of the well house and surrounding area. Dr. Harrison's team discovered tool marks on the ground near the well that matched shovels and trowels found in a locked cabinet in the plantation's tool shed. These tools showed traces of concrete and mortar consistent with the materials used to seal the well. More damning still was the discovery of a leather-bound ledger hidden behind a loose brick in the plantation's main office. This ledger, written in a hand later identified as belonging to George Wilson, the estate manager, contained cryptic entries dated between September 9th and September 15th, 1902, the week when the Blackwood sisters disappeared. September 9. Confrontation unavoidable. E&E discovered everything. Taylor loyal to them to the end. Judge H advises permanent solution. September 10th. Well house secured. All evidence removed from main house. The matter is concluded. September 15th. Judge H has arranged for all papers to be in order. Official story established. I am to manage the estate until the auction can be arranged. My compensation has been secured. When confronted with this evidence on July 3rd, George Wilson initially denied all knowledge of the murders. However, after 8 hours of interrogation, he broke down and provided a confession that would implicate not only himself, but several of Whitehaven's most prominent citizens. According to the transcript of Wilson's confession, preserved in the Alabama State Archives, but sealed by court order until 1978, the murders of the Blackwood twins and their driver were the culmination of a conspiracy that had begun months earlier. It wasn't supposed to end that way. Nobody was supposed to die. We just needed to scare them enough to make them sell and leave Whitehaven. Wilson went on to explain that a consortium of local businessmen and landowners, led by Judge William Hartwell, had been engaged in a scheme to acquire the Blackwood estate at a fraction of its value. The plantation's location was ideal for a planned railroad spur that would connect Whitehaven to the main line at Talladega, vastly increasing property values in the area. The judge approached me in the spring of 1902, Wilson stated, said that progress was coming to Whitehaven and that I could either profit from it or be left behind. All I had to do was help convince the Blackwood girls to sell. Wilson's initial efforts had focused on making the plantation appear unprofitable, falsifying accounts and sabotaging equipment. When these tactics failed to discourage the determined sisters, the conspirators became more desperate. Eleanor was the problem, Wilson confessed. She was too smart, kept finding ways to make the plantation turn a profit, despite everything I did. And she started asking questions, looking into the account books too closely. By August, she suspected something was wrong. The situation came to a head in early September when Eleanor discovered correspondence between Wilson and Judge Hartwell discussing the railroad plans. According to Wilson, she confronted him on the morning of September 9th, threatening to expose the conspiracy. She and Eliza were going into town to speak with Sheriff Parker. They took Taylor with them because they didn't trust any of the other staff by that point. I rode ahead and met with the judge and the others. They said they'd handle it, make sure the sisters never reached town. What happened next, according to Wilson's confession, was not part of the original plan. Hartwell sent some men, I don't know who exactly, he never told me their names, to intercept the carriage. They were just supposed to scare the sisters, maybe rough up Taylor a bit if he resisted, but something went wrong. When they brought them back to the plantation that night, Taylor was already badly beaten, barely conscious. The sisters were terrified, but defiant. The conspirators, now including Wilson, Judge Hartwell, and at least 3 other men, whose identities Wilson claimed not to know, decided that they had crossed a line from which there was no return. If the sisters or Taylor were allowed to tell their story, everyone involved would face serious charges. The judge said there was only one way to ensure their silence. I argued against it, said there had to be another way, but he was adamant. He said they had a permanent solution that would never be discovered. That solution, as Wilson finally admitted, was the well house. They dragged Taylor to the well house first. He was barely conscious by then. 2 of the men, big fellows, strong, they lifted him up and just dropped him down the well shaft. We could hear the impact when he hit bottom. Then they brought the sisters. They were fighting, screaming. Eleanor spit in the judge's face. He slapped her so hard she fell to the ground. Eliza ran to her sister, tried to shield her. That's when the judge ordered them both thrown down the well too. What Wilson described next was perhaps the most horrifying detail of the entire confession. We could hear them down there. Eleanor was shouting up at us, cursing us, saying we would pay for what we'd done. Eliza was crying, begging us to at least throw down some water. The judge just smiled and said, "Start mixing the concrete." It took hours to seal that well properly. The whole time we could hear them down there. Eleanor's voice got weaker, but she never stopped cursing us. Eliza just sobbed. By morning, when we finished the job, they had gone quiet. In the aftermath, according to Wilson, Judge Hartwell took charge of creating a cover story and ensuring that any investigation would quickly be abandoned. The judge handled everything. He told me what to tell people if they asked about the sisters. He arranged for the carriage to be found abandoned on the road. He even had someone write letters in Eleanor's hand, supposedly from New York, that arrived a few months later. Everyone believed they had just decided to leave, to escape their responsibilities here. When asked why he was confessing now, after 6 years of silence, Wilson's response was chilling. "I haven't had a night's sleep since we sealed that well. I see their faces every time I close my eyes. I hear Eleanor's voice in my dreams, still cursing us, promising that she and her sister will have justice. And lately I've been seeing them when I'm awake too, standing at the foot of my bed, soaking wet, their eyes empty and dark. They're coming for all of us who were there that night. Maybe if I tell the truth, if I help bring justice, maybe they'll let me rest." Sheriff Parker immediately ordered the arrest of Judge William Hartwell following Wilson's confession. However, when deputies arrived at the judge's home on the morning of July 4th, 1908, they found him dead in his study, an apparent suicide by hanging. A note found on his desk read simply, "They were waiting for me in the darkness. I go now to face my judgment." With both Wilson's confession and Hartwell's suicide note, the case against the conspiracy seemed strong. However, Wilson's claim that he did not know the identities of the other participants complicated matters. Despite intense investigation, Sheriff Parker was never able to conclusively identify the big fellows who had physically carried out the murders. Several prominent Whitehaven businessmen came under suspicion, particularly those who had purchased land along the proposed railroad route shortly after the Blackwood sisters' disappearance. Yet without concrete evidence or additional confessions, no further arrests were made. George Wilson was charged with 3 counts of murder and conspiracy. His trial, held in Montgomery rather than Talladega County due to concerns about local bias, began on October 12, 1908. Despite the detailed confession he had provided to Sheriff Parker, Wilson recanted on the witness stand, claiming that his statement had been coerced through threats and physical abuse, allegations that Parker vehemently denied. The prosecution presented the physical evidence found at the scene, including the ledger with Wilson's incriminating notes, as well as the testimony of Dr. Harrison regarding the condition of the victim's remains. However, without Wilson's confession, the case became largely circumstantial. After 7 days of testimony and arguments, the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a verdict of not guilty on all counts. The foreman, a wealthy landowner from a county adjacent to Talladega, would later be discovered to have significant business ties to several Whitehaven property owners who had been implicated in Wilson's original confession. Sheriff Parker was reportedly furious at the verdict. In a letter to Dr. Harrison dated October 20th, he wrote, "Justice has been denied to the Blackwood sisters and Isaac Taylor. The conspiracy that took their lives extends far beyond what we initially suspected, reaching into the very institutions that are supposed to uphold the law. I cannot and will not abandon this case, regardless of the cost to my career or reputation." True to his word, Parker continued his investigation, focusing now on the financial connections between various Whitehaven businessmen and the railroad interests that had sought the Blackwood property. He traced land purchases, followed money trails, and slowly began to assemble a picture of corruption that extended beyond Talladega County and into the highest levels of Alabama politics. On December 3, 1908, 2 months after Wilson's acquittal, Sheriff Parker disappeared. His horse was found abandoned on a rural road outside Whitehaven, in a scene eerily reminiscent of the abandoned Blackwood carriage 6 years earlier. Despite an extensive search led by his deputies, no trace of Parker was ever found. The official investigation into his disappearance was cursory at best. The new sheriff, appointed by the county commissioners rather than elected, showed little interest in pursuing the matter, declaring after just 2 weeks that Parker had likely fled the area due to gambling debts, a claim vehemently disputed by Parker's wife and deputies, who noted that the sheriff had been meticulous in his personal finances and had never shown any interest in gambling. In the absence of Parker's driving force, the investigation into the Blackwood murders gradually faded from official attention. George Wilson left Whitehaven shortly after his acquittal, reportedly moving west to California, though no official record of his life after the trial exists. The Blackwood sisters and Isaac Taylor were finally laid to rest in the town cemetery on November 1, 1908, in a ceremony attended by only a handful of people, mostly former servants from the plantation and a few local citizens who had known the sisters. Notably absent were any representatives of Whitehaven's elite families or business leaders. As for Joseph Miller, the northern industrialist whose renovation project had uncovered the grisly secret of the well house, he abandoned his plans for the Blackwood estate, selling the property at a loss to a corporation based in Montgomery. That corporation, later revealed to be a front for the very railroad interests that had coveted the land 6 years earlier, promptly demolished the mansion and outbuildings, erasing all physical evidence of the crimes that had occurred there. The railroad spur was completed in 1910, bringing the promised economic boom to certain sections of Whitehaven, particularly those owned by the businessmen who had been implicated in Wilson's confession. Within a decade, the once rural area had been transformed into a bustling transportation hub, with the former Blackwood Plantation at its center. And yet, despite the prosperity that came to the town, a shadow seemed to hang over Whitehaven. Local legends began to emerge about the railroad station built on the Blackwood property, stories of inexplicable cold spots, of the sound of women weeping heard late at night, of railroad workers refusing to remain on site after dark. Most persistent were the tales of 2 identical women in 19th-century dress seen walking along the tracks at twilight, always vanishing when approached. These sightings, first reported by railroad workers in 1911, continue to this day, with the most recent documented encounter occurring in 2022. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Blackwood case is what happened to those who had been present at the well house that fateful night in September 1902. Judge William Hartwell's suicide was just the beginning. Between 1908 and 1915, each of the Whitehaven businessmen suspected of involvement in the conspiracy died under unusual or violent circumstances. Edward Thompson, owner of the local bank, drowned in his bathtub in 1909. Henry Davis, a prominent landowner, was found hanged in his barn in 1912 in a manner strikingly similar to Judge Hartwell's death. Charles Roberts, who had purchased significant property along the railroad route, died in a house fire in 1915, with investigators noting that all doors and windows had been locked from the inside. In each case, witnesses reported that the men had become increasingly paranoid in the weeks before their deaths, speaking of being watched, of seeing identical women standing at the foot of their beds or reflected in mirrors. Several had reportedly begun to keep lights burning throughout the night, afraid of what might be waiting for them in the darkness. As for George Wilson, the estate manager whose confession had briefly brought the conspiracy to light, his fate remains unknown. The last confirmed sighting of Wilson was in San Francisco in 1910, where he was working as a clerk in a shipping office. According to his employer, Wilson was a nervous man who drank heavily and spoke often of twin shadows that followed him wherever he went. In 1915, a body was discovered in a San Francisco boarding house, so badly decomposed that identification was difficult. Personal effects suggested it might have been Wilson, though this was never conclusively proven. The coroner's report noted unusual circumstances. The room had been locked from the inside, with towels stuffed around the door and windows as if the occupant had been trying to seal himself in. Most strange was the coroner's observation that the deceased appears to have expired in a state of extreme terror, with an expression of horror fixed upon his features and his hands raised as if to ward off an attacker, though no evidence of another individual's presence was found. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, though the coroner privately expressed his belief that the man had literally died of fright. The Blackwood case might have faded entirely from public memory were it not for the efforts of Amelia Parker, Sheriff Parker's daughter, who spent decades collecting evidence and testimonies related to her father's disappearance and the murders that preceded it. Her research, published in a self-printed monograph in 1978, titled Buried Secrets, the Blackwood Sisters and the Conspiracy of Silence, provided the first comprehensive account of the case for the general public. Amelia's work revealed connections and patterns that had gone unnoticed during the original investigation. Most significantly, she discovered that in the years following the Blackwood murders, several of the conspirators had reported strikingly similar experiences before their deaths. Experiences that echoed George Wilson's final confession to Sheriff Parker. They all spoke of seeing the twins, Amelia wrote. Always together, always silent, always watching, always wet, as if they had just emerged from the well where they died. Judge Hartwell's housekeeper reported that in the week before his suicide, he refused to sleep, staying awake for days at a time. When she asked him why, he reportedly said, "They're waiting for me to close my eyes. They stand at the foot of my bed, dripping water onto the floor. They don't speak, they just wait." Similar accounts emerged from the households of the other suspected conspirators. Servants reported finding puddles of water in sealed rooms, hearing the sound of dripping when no water source was present, glimpsing identical women in mirrors or reflections who vanished when directly observed. The pattern is unmistakable, Amelia concluded in her monograph. Whether these experiences were manifestations of guilt or something more supernatural, they connect all those involved in the murders of Eliza and Eleanor Blackwood and Isaac Taylor. One by one, those responsible faced a reckoning that went beyond human justice. Amelia's research also uncovered a disturbing epilogue to the case. In 1929, during expansion of the railroad facilities on the former Blackwood property, workers uncovered a sealed chamber beneath what had once been the main house, a room whose existence was not recorded in any of the original plantation blueprints. Inside this hidden space, investigators found evidence suggesting that the conspiracy against the Blackwood sisters had roots far deeper and darker than financial gain. The chamber contained arcane symbols painted on the walls, collections of unusual artifacts, and a journal believed to have belonged to Colonel William Blackwood, the twins' father. The journal, portions of which were reproduced in Amelia's monograph, suggested that the colonel had been involved in esoteric practices, possibly connected to a secret society operating throughout the South in the post-Civil War era. Most disturbing were his entries regarding his twin daughters. E continue to exhibit the connection in ways that both fascinate and disturb. Today, while Eleanor was in town with me, Eliza, miles away at the plantation, experienced the same cut to her hand that Eleanor suffered from a broken glass. Dr. Edwards witnessed this phenomenon and was most disturbed, though I assured him it was merely a strange coincidence. The girls' ability to sense each other's thoughts grows stronger. They complete each other's sentences now without hesitation. Yesterday, when I spoke privately to Eleanor in my study, Eliza, who had been in the garden, later repeated our conversation verbatim, though she could not have overheard us. The ancient texts speak of twin souls as potential vessels. I've begun to wonder if E&E might be what the Order has sought for so long. The final entries in the Colonel's journal, dated shortly before his death from typhoid in 1897, took on an increasingly paranoid tone. I have decided against initiating E&E into the mysteries. The risk is too great. Judge H disagrees vehemently, insists that we will never find more perfect vessels. But I have seen how the connection manifests between them, growing stronger each year. To subject them to the ritual might unleash forces beyond our control. H and the others do not understand what they are dealing with. They see only the potential power, not the danger. I've removed the key texts from the chamber and hidden them where they will never be found. After my death, the knowledge will be lost. This is for the best. Some doors are meant to remain closed. These writings suggest that Judge Hartwell and possibly other members of Whitehaven's elite had been part of Colonel Blackwood's secret order. After his death, they may have continued their arcane pursuits, with the twins as their focus. It seems likely, Amelia Parker wrote, that the Blackwood sisters discovered the hidden chamber and their father's journals sometime in 1902, learning not only of the railroad conspiracy, but of this darker plot surrounding them. This would explain why their murder became necessary to men like Judge Hartwell. The sisters had uncovered secrets far beyond mere financial corruption. The hidden chamber was hastily resealed, following its discovery, on orders from county officials citing structural concerns. Before this occurred, however, one of the workers reportedly removed a small object from the room, a locket containing a photograph of the Blackwood twins as young women, their images facing each other rather than the camera. This locket eventually came into Amelia Parker's possession through the worker's family. In the final pages of her monograph, Amelia described an unsettling experience with this artifact. I keep the locket in a drawer in my desk. Sometimes when the house is quiet, I hear it clicking open and closed, though when I check, it remains exactly as I left it. Twice now, I have found small puddles of water around it, though there is no explanation for how they formed. Most disturbing was what occurred last autumn, on the anniversary of the sisters' disappearance. I woke in the night to find two identical women standing at the foot of my bed, their dark hair hanging limp around pale faces, their clothes soaked with water. They said nothing, merely watched me with eyes that seemed to hold infinite sadness and infinite rage. I was terrified, unable to move or speak. Then one of them, I couldn't tell whether it was meant to be Eliza or Eleanor, slowly raised her arm and pointed not at me, but past me, toward the window. I gathered my courage and turned to look in the direction she indicated. Through the glass, in the moonlight, I could see the railroad tracks gleaming silver in the distance, cutting across what had once been Blackwood land. When I turned back, they were gone, leaving only two small puddles of water on the floor. Amelia Parker died in 1983, having dedicated the latter portion of her life to uncovering the truth about the Blackwood case. Her monograph, though initially dismissed as sensationalism by mainstream historians, has gained credibility in recent years as county records and newspaper archives have corroborated many of her findings. The railroad facilities built on the former Blackwood Plantation remained in operation until 1972, when the line was decommissioned as part of wider changes to the region's transportation infrastructure. The land was subsequently purchased by a development company that planned to build a residential community on the site. Strangely, despite multiple attempts over the decades, No permanent structure has successfully been maintained on the property where the Blackwood Mansion and its well house once stood. Construction projects have been plagued by unexplained accidents, financial reversals, and the inexplicable reluctance of workers to remain on site after sunset. Local residents still report sightings of identical twin women walking along the old railroad bed, particularly on September nights when the moon is full. Some claim to have heard women's voices emerging from the ground where the well house once stood, sometimes pleading, sometimes cursing, but always speaking in unison. The most recent development plan for the property, a commercial complex announced in 2019, was abruptly cancelled after the lead architect resigned from the project, citing irreconcilable ethical concerns. When pressed for details in a local newspaper interview, he would say only that some ground is not meant to be built upon. Some stories are not meant to be forgotten. Today, the former Blackwood Plantation remains undeveloped, a strangely empty patch of land in an otherwise bustling area. Local authorities discourage visitors, citing safety concerns due to the overgrown conditions and remnants of old foundations. Those who ignore these warnings and venture onto the property after dark often report feeling watched, hearing whispers that seem to come from the ground beneath their feet, and finding themselves inexplicably drawn toward a clearing where the well house once stood. Most disturbing are the accounts from those who have used modern equipment to examine the site. In 2015, a team of archaeology students from the University of Alabama conducted a ground-penetrating radar survey of the area, hoping to locate the foundations of the original plantation buildings for a historical mapping project. Their equipment malfunctioned repeatedly, particularly when pointed toward the presumed location of the well house. When they finally obtained usable data from this area, it revealed an anomaly that their professors could not explain: what appeared to be two human-shaped figures, side by side, approximately 20 feet below the surface, where the well should have been filled in decades ago.